Hello, I'm Dr. Suzanne Culshaw. I'm a research fellow in the School of Education at the University of Hertfordshire.
Hi, my name's Dr. Suzanne Albary. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior lecturer in business research methods at Suffolk Business School, University of Suffolk. So Suzanne was due to come in to help me teach visual research methods to MBA students in March 2020, and unfortunately the lockdown obviously stopped that from happening, and that provided a really interesting opportunity needing to switch teaching and delivering visual research methods in an online space. So this conversation is about how we went about doing that, some of the lessons that we learned, some of the challenges that we had about both teaching and doing visual research methods online, and some of the things that we're going to take forward into our future practice. So Suzanne, you actually had a research project on the go at the time of lockdown, didn't you?
Yeah. So I'm part of a European project called Enables, and we're looking, the short version is that we're looking at how arts-based and embodied methods can help strengthen distributed leadership in schools. And the plan was always to use collage as the arts-based method. It's something I've used in my research before, face-to-face, in person, with box of materials and things. And I know that when I was supposed to be coming here for the session last year, I was going to bring boxes with me, and we were going to get very hands-on and do stuff in person. The pandemic arrived, and we switched very quickly to using collage online, which was really exciting because I had all these kind of notions of, but how's it going to work? We thought about it quite long and hard, and then we had a go. So as a team of researchers, we had a go at doing collage kind of at our workstations but via Zoom, and noticed a couple of things which I'm sure we'll talk about, but so we've taken it online, and actually now I think there are some real benefits of doing collage, which is my kind of specialism, online. So I'm really looking forward to talking about it a bit more today.
Excellent. So obviously you were going to come in and actually help me deliver a session teaching MBA students and sort of exploring how we can use visual methods in the classroom, but also how they can use that in their management projects and their dissertations. And it was my first foray really into using visual methods. I'd sort of dabbled a little bit with the teaching in photo elicitation, but other than that I hadn't really done anything. And then as soon as you were no longer able to come in, I had to completely rethink how I was going to teach a physical research method online, and make it interesting and engaging, and not just be about talking about how to do it.
Yeah.
Because that's the
physicality of it. Yeah.
There is a very physical part of doing in-person visual research methods.
Yeah.
And I know that there is a long history of doing online digital methods, things like photo diaries, video diaries, that kind of thing. But really what I wanted to do was something kind of in-person, using your hands, working with people. And one of the first things I did after you not being able to come in was do a podcast with you.
Yeah. Gosh, yeah, we did, didn't we?
Which was very interesting. Yeah. And it was a really, I thought, engaging conversation, and something that obviously this is almost an evolution of. And the students really liked it. They liked being able to hear something that was a little less formal than a lecture. And I think we were able to capture a little bit more about that physicality in the conversation than we would have done if we were just delivering a lecture.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? That kind of, we were talking before the recording started, weren't we, about kind of presentations and being presented to. I think the idea of an organic conversation like this feels perhaps a little bit more human, a little bit more personal. I really enjoyed doing that podcast. It was really good because it was a really useful opportunity to think and talk out loud about, kind of something I feel really strongly about. Visual methods, creative methods, arts-based methods. They kind of come under the same umbrella, don't they? Have been part of my life now for the last 5 years or so, and I really do believe that they are powerful, and they do my little strap line is, collage does funny things to people because it can reveal things that you maybe weren't anticipating. And there's a little bit of a tension there, isn't there, when you're kind of encouraging or facilitating those kind of methods, that will people reveal things that they might not otherwise have done? Well, we don't know, do we? But so ethically there are some considerations, but there are with all research methods, aren't there? When you meet someone in person or online for an interview, there are ethical considerations there as well. So I don't want to over-egg that really, but I do think that they can unsettle people. These kind of methods can unsettle, and I've often wondered why that is really, and I don't know, but I wonder whether we're just not used to being, I'm going to say, playful, and I think it is that kind of, there's something very tactile and physical about moving things around. A particular kind of collage that I've been using is where you can move things around and you tend not to stick things down. And there's something quite playful about that. And perhaps we adults have kind of unlearned that.
We have certainly lost some of that playfulness. I know when I'm talking about visual methods to my students, and they are business students, they're here for a Masters in Business Administration, they often start the session on visual methods or creative methods with a kind of, this is sweet, but it's not something that I can use in my organisation, in my business. And then by the time we get to the end of the session, they're like, I had no idea that it could be used in such a way. I had no idea about the things that I could do with visual methods. And I remember one session I did, so I was doing, rather than collage, I was teaching the very first session of visual methods I taught online. I did photo elicitation.
Right, yeah.
And I posed them a question, and I put up a Padlet board, and I said, okay, so you've got 10 minutes, go off onto the internet, the wonders of the internet, and find some pictures that you feel really represent your answers to these questions. And they looked at me as if I was mad. And then they did a bit of Googling, and then suddenly, one or two photos appeared, and then one or two more, and then all of a sudden the floodgates opened, and lots of photos were appearing on this Padlet board. And I was like, wonderful, thank you very much, this is great. I'm going to spend a few minutes, you can watch me do this. I'm going to organise these into what I feel like are some themes.
Oh, that's interesting. So you kind of modelled it live.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
To show them how you might do that.
Yeah.
And then it was a point of, okay, so we're going to take some of these themes and we're going to talk about them. And I'm going to talk about what I think is there. And then I'm going to ask you if you're happy to talk about if one of these or more photos were yours. And am I even close? So I would talk through one of the themes, and they would say, oh, no, that's not what I meant by that photo.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's fine. That's absolutely brilliant that you've told me that. And this is one of the things that we need to remember when we're doing visual methods, is to go back to our participants and just clarify with them if what we're pulling out of that is in fact what was there, what they meant by that.
I think that's really critical actually. That's that whole kind of whose meaning is it? And I call them kind of the collage creators, and I can look at a collage that's created by somebody else and imagine what I might kind of interpret it as, but I think that involving the creator or the person who chose the photo in your instance, I think that's really important, isn't it? Because something spoke to them. So I think that's right. But isn't it interesting that sometimes people don't actually immediately know why they chose something or what they meant by it, but actually by offering a possible interpretation, you've then it can then spark oh yes, that is what I think, or oh no, do you know what, that's not that at all. But that stimulus, I think, by the researcher in this instance, I think can be really useful, because otherwise they may not know what they thought. So that they're kind of dropping in those stimulus questions, I think, can be really useful. Yeah, fascinating. That's really interesting actually, because I think some people really kind of struggle to start with the process. And it's interesting what you said about the Padlet and how maybe one courageous person put a photo in, and then that kind of there's almost like a permission, isn't there? Right, there's one in there, I now know the kind of thing. I've tended not to show images of kind of previously created collages to people before, until we've done it online. So in person, I'd just say, oh, use the materials that you've got here, to express, and then whatever the research question is. And online, I've kind of tended to show a couple of collages just to say, these are the kind of things other people have created. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't want to show a template. It's not this is what you've got to do. This is just, and I try and show a real diversity of image. Sometimes they just kind of look like just things on a piece of paper, and sometimes there's kind of a shape to it. You think, oh, that could be a person, or that could be a head, or whatever. So there's a decision to be made, isn't there, about whether you show something or model it or not, or just leave people up to it. That's really interesting. Yeah.
So when you're actually doing these collages, are they using an online platform, or are they a person has a set of equipment or stuff?
Yeah. It's a really good question, because we thought about that. We thought long and hard about whether to send stuff, and I now wonder what that was all about, really, because there's a kind of a control there, isn't over what the items were, and kind of predetermining what we want them to use. So the ethics committee just didn't allow us to send stuff in the post, which is fine, really, I guess, because we then asked our participants to select some items. I kind of call them general bits and bobs, because I don't like to be too prescriptive, but I said maybe stationery items or craft items, bits of ribbon, buttons, if you've got that kind of thing lying around. And so we sent the same kind of standard text out to all our participants and said, you might like to have a think about what items you'd like to have around you before we do the collage. But no, so we didn't send anything out. We didn't know what people would have. And that was really interesting. And for the first time, I've kind of freed myself up from thinking I had to. I just didn't think I'd thought about it before. I wasn't predetermining the items that people were using, and it was amazing to see. So we had about 20, just over 20 participants in total in small workshops, about 4 at a time, and it was amazing what they were using. Some people just used Post-its and kind of layered them up and kind of put them in different places, and then other people had paper clips and bits of ribbon and all kinds. So it was really interesting to see the kind of items. And what I thought was interesting was that there were some personal items coming in. So, things that people have on their desk, perhaps like a paperweight or something like that. And somebody talked about they liked the heaviness of the actual item was heavy, and it represented for them feeling weighed down. So it was really interesting to see what people brought to the table, to their table, in order to create a collage. So,
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? Around, you used to provide these things, but even that provision in that way feels like you're, with hindsight and with a bit of reflection, almost feels like you're confining people to a particular set of materials.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm thinking now about the kinds of things that I might do if I was to do this. I was like, well, I'd definitely be going out into my garden and picking up some pretty looking stones, maybe some leaves that are there. All of these different things that perhaps haven't appeared in the collage that you've done before.
Yes, exactly. And I did some in-person collage recently, actually, which is the first time since kind of pandemic restrictions have been lessened, shall we say. And there were boxes, there were predetermined boxes, but people did go outside, and that was really interesting when you mentioned that, picked leaves and brought really bits of twig and things like that in for some of their collages. And one woman there said that she was glad that there was a box of stuff, because she'd done a session with me earlier on in the year online, so she kind of got both experiences, really interesting. And she had to choose her own items, and she'd really struggled. So she liked having some predetermined items. So maybe what we're learning from this is to have some, and then to allow some flexibility. I mean, I always did that with my doctoral participants. One in particular wanted to use several items of his for his collage, and of course, why would that not be okay? Of course, it's okay. But most tended to kind of just confine themselves to what was in the box. I mean, it's a very nice box, and there's some very nice shiny things in there. But I think that's really interesting what you're saying about natural items. Yeah.
But also that, as you were saying about personal items, I mean, I might be sitting there thinking, actually, maybe a ring,
yes,
or maybe not.
Yeah.
One that I might be worried about particularly losing, but you take the items off your person and put them onto the paper. I mean, items that mean something personally to you have a different impact on the results of your data collection than something that I've taken out of a box that doesn't belong to me that I've never seen before until that day.
Yeah, and I might potentially be giving back and that person takes away again.
Yeah.
You know, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Yeah. And I think that, you know, there are other methods, aren't there, where you can ask a participant to bring an artifact that kind of means something to them. And I was involved in a session recently, actually, where I obviously haven't got the memo because I was a presenter, but everybody else in the room had been asked to bring something with them, and it was really powerful, this kind of bring something personal. And so because I was doing the collage with them later on, this is in person now, but I said to them, well, if you feel moved to use that personal artifact that you talked about earlier on in your collage, then please do. And some people did. So that's a really nice kind of combination of bringing one thing as a stimulus for a conversation perhaps, to then using it as a wider expression of an experience or an issue or a challenge.
I think that's a really important point, and something that I try and talk to my students a lot about when we're using and talking about research methods generally, is that one method doesn't necessarily sit in isolation. So you're talking there about the kind of the Venn diagram of an object interview, if we're going to give it its formal title, you know, an object interview, and then visual methods, creative methods using collage or arts-based methods, or there's another phrase for it. Craft-based.
I like the phrase craft-based, actually.
I think when we were having a conversation in the podcast, actually, the difference between arts-based and craft-based, and sort of art being, you know, people of a certain level of, for example, talent create art, but craft is available to everybody. So there is almost a perception difference between them, isn't there? But no, I think that's really interesting what you were saying there about people being able to bring their own items and their own personal items, things that might have meaning layered upon meaning upon, you know, into something like a collage.
Yeah. Can I come back to something you said earlier on? You were talking about your students and how they kind of were a bit sceptical. That's kind of what I heard you say, that you were a bit sceptical, but by the end they kind of realised something. And I'm just wondering about how important it is to create the conditions to allow people to feel safe enough to kind of engage. So what was it that you think you did with those students that allowed them to dip their toe into the creative methods or visual methods waters?
I think that's a really good point, and one of the things that I was really clear about is that there is a level of reflection needed, like personal reflection. You know, you're not going to be 100% objective when you come to the table when you're using qualitative methods generally, let alone something like visual methods, because we all have different perceptions based on the colour red or a particular type of object. And it's absolutely okay for you not to be fully scientifically, quantitatively subjective. And one of the really nice things I find about teaching research methods, particularly to master's students, is they tend to be quite small cohorts. They come to me at the end of the programme, so just before they're about to embark on a piece of very independent study, their dissertation. They've known one another for a while, so there is already a kind of a group dynamic. They know if they trust one another, they've worked together before, and they're all professionals. And I always start those sessions, or I always start the kind of the discursive part of those sessions by discussing one of my own images. And I've put an image on there, and I'll ask them, what do they think about this image? And I'm more than happy for them to say basically whatever they want. I'm like, you're absolutely right. When I put that image on there, that's what I meant. Or actually, when I put that image on there, it's not about what you might think. It's about this. And I'm quite open with my students about my experiences in the image, why I've put particular images. So, for example, on the Padlet board, and one of the things was getting to spend more time with my partner. And at the time, my partner hadn't been very well, so I was like, I like being at home. I like being able to check in with him to make sure he's okay. And a lot of my students had already known that because they've seen my out of office. They know that I'm working a little bit odd hours. And that level of openness, honesty with my students, and letting them see a little bit of that vulnerability really opens the door for them to feel that way in that space, and for them to feel that way towards me. And I'm not saying that you have to be vulnerable with your students, but I do think you need to set a level of expectation about what's safe in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really important. It's something we gave a lot of thought to, actually, in terms of our online workshops for the project that I mentioned earlier on, because actually asking people to engage like that it can make you feel quite vulnerable, can't it? And we were dealing with people who, on the whole, didn't know each other. And so we were inviting people to online workshops from across the country. And, just one aside, I think by being online, it meant people could attend these and participate in these workshops from a very diverse kind of, geographically very diverse regions, which they may not have been able to do otherwise. Anyway, we kind of had to create what we've called an aesthetic environment to allow people to feel safe. And that was quite challenging in some ways, because you didn't know whether the people were going to feel comfortable with each other, but in some ways using Zoom helped, because we said to people, if you want to have your camera off, you can. And I think we've kind of learned to be different online than we maybe would be in person. And just one thing we found when people were doing their collages is, and as a researcher, you think, I can't see you doing it. I'd love to see you doing it. I'd like to see when you put things down or whatever. So you kind of have to step away from that, because you tend not to be able to see the process of the collage creation, because they've either got their camera off or the way that their laptop's set up, means you can't see the desk in front of them. But there's an intimacy there in a way. They can kind of just be very much focused on the process, particularly if they've chosen to have their camera off, which means they're not looking over their shoulder at others. They're not kind of comparing themselves with, oh gosh, I like your collage, mine's not very good. That kind of almost like a performative aspect of doing something like this. So in some ways, these workshops allowed people to have a fairly intimate space with themselves, and then they were invited, and I think that's the key word, they were invited, if they felt comfortable to do so, to share their images. So they would, and it's possible, isn't it, to screen share, and we would then see a photograph of their collage, and then they had the opportunity to talk to it, and others had an opportunity to respond to it. And so it was just a nice, small, never more than 4 participants, and me as the facilitator and one researcher in the room, to never more than 6 people in a Zoom room. And it was amazing how intimate it felt. But we'd given a lot of thought to kind of, and I could quote, I think it's Sutherland 2012, aestheticising the environment, as it's called, making it feel like an environment in which you feel safe and prepared to be a little bit vulnerable. So, but it's a risk, isn't it? It feels like a risk asking people to do it. And, I remember one participant in particular really said, I'm not sure how to get started on this. Now, in person, what would I have done? I would have taken them aside and kind of talked to them quietly and said, you might like to think about, what kind of materials have you got? Have you got an image in your mind you'd like to use as a starting point? Whereas online, you feel you're quite visible, and that kind of going aside, I'm not sure that was as easy to do.
It's much less subtle, isn't it? Because you can go into a different Zoom room, and you can go
we could have done, but in the moment, I didn't feel.
But it feels very
that I could respond in that way.
And you become you separate them then, and they become very. They're almost highlighted in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be in person, and I think that is definitely something we need to think about. It's like setting someone aside from
so
the
what
group.
I did was I asked the other workshop participants to switch off the sound on their laptops while I was having this kind of little conversation with this person. But that's not ideal, but in the moment I had to do something, because I think it was the difference between this person giving it a go and not giving it a go, and so I felt on his behalf that he was being even more vulnerable than he needed to be, because we were doing it fairly publicly. As it is, he said afterwards that it was really helpful that I'd given him kind of some pointers, but that's interesting, isn't it? I think other people engaged because perhaps they were more predisposed to engaging anyway. And I think that's something that I think, I'll bring into the conversation now, is that who is attracted to these kind of methods and why are they attracted? I haven't got an answer necessarily to these, but who's attracted to these methods and why do people choose to participate in things like we were doing for Enables? And I haven't really got the answer to that, but there were a lot of women. There were a lot of women in participants and very few men, and I don't know what to make of that. And there were some art teachers. Well, you talked about art earlier on, didn't you? And I think it's interesting that I wasn't asking them to create art. I wasn't even necessarily asking them to be artistic, but it's engaging in that kind of creative process. But I think, methods like this can conjure up, fears or memories of art at school, for example, and I wasn't very good at art, or I can't draw, and those kind of things. And although it isn't drawing, it's a very different kind of process. I think it can bring up those kind of memories for some people. And so, I think that you've reminded me of the craft-based phrase, and I think going forward, I quite like that, really.
And you've also got that challenge, haven't you? It goes back to what you were saying earlier about it being a little bit more playful, and in particular contexts, people not thinking, well, I don't do that. I'm an adult, or looking at those methods as being less valid. So one of the people that I spoke to on my podcast originally was saying they did visual methods, they were doing sketches, and one of the participants says, no, I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
By the end of the thing, they'd created quite a nice little sketch, but then at the start of the question was, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think, we need to, be quite sensitive to the fact that, some people aren't going to want to engage, either to begin with or at all. But also there's this perception that some of these methods maybe aren't quite as valid as other methods. And I think we are getting past that, I think, generally. And a festival like this an event like this is a really good way of doing that. And I don't think anyone who's listening to this will be thinking that way. But what are some of the things that you make sure you do to ensure the validity of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I guess it's what role do the methods play in the bigger picture when you're doing research, for example. And I've often thought that the collages are data in and of themselves, and I do think that. But actually we also tend to ask people, I've always tended to ask people to talk to their collages and to kind of explicitly say what things mean. And so in a way that's starting to get a little bit of validity and kind of not bringing too much of my interpretation to it, and going back to what I said earlier about the meaning residing really with the creator of the collage. But so that's one way of kind of triangulating between what the collage might say and what they say in their verbal data. But there are ambiguities. Research is messy, isn't it? Qualitative research is messy anyway. And so I'm reminded, this wasn't an online session, but I'm reminded of an in-person interview that I did with somebody, and they presented a particular image in their collage, but that really didn't come up in the kind of the spoken interview. But you don't have to bring those two things together, because we're complex beings, aren't we? And that was part of this person's story and lived experience. And what they spoke about was also part of their lived experience. And so I think it adds a richness. It makes it more difficult because, some of us quite like, boxes to put things in and quantify. But actually that's not what it's about. It's about a rich story. It's a narrative. And the visual aspect of this person's story was very strong, as was their verbal story. So, I think we have to be open to the fact that we're not just getting people to do pictures and then we're going to analyse them and nothing else. It's the interacting with. And I also think that my interpretation of those pictures has a place. So I think I am able to, and it is okay if I bring my meaning and my interpretation to those collages. But it's how we then write about it and how much kind of we place an emphasis on whether it's true or not. That's not what we're saying. We're saying this is someone's story. This is my interpretation of someone's story. And I offer it up to be read by other people, and it's for them to gauge whether it feels plausible or real enough. So I don't know if that answers your question really.
I think so, and I think you make a good point, isn't it? It's part of the part of the narrative, and if the visual method set part of the research doesn't connect in the interview with the verbal part, it's still an important part of the process, because someone has taken time, consideration, thought, reflection to create that, that's maybe made them think about things a little bit differently, made them think about things in a little bit more depth, in a different way that they can then articulate after having done that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That's kind of the revelatory nature of it. So it may be that it's part of that process, isn't it, of kind of starting to think about, I'm almost struggling now to put things into words, and some experiences can't immediately be articulated in that way. And I think it's a different way of thinking. I can't remember the direct quote now, but it's about visual thinking rather than linguistic thinking, and it's an opportunity for some people to think differently. I was talking to somebody the other day who told me that they think in pictures, and I don't think I do. I think in words, really. And it was really interesting that they engaged very easily with the collage, because that's kind of almost their preferred way of thinking, and they used their collage to then, they're a school leader, they're then putting their school improvement plan into words on the basis of a collage. And you think that it's just really interesting to be able to allow people to think in a way that they can access. And I think that says something, doesn't it, about the privileging of the spoken, or the written, in particular the written word, and I think that's something I feel more and more strongly about, is that actually the spoken word is not the only way to elicit meaning.
I think that's a really good point, particularly if you think once you've said something, it's been said, and you can't unsay that, and once you've said something, it tends to solidify in a way that becomes very rigid, whereas on a piece of paper where you've got a movable collage, you can explore problems, move things around before you get to that point of solidifying in the written or spoken word.
Yeah, which is why I'm a bit anti-glue, if I'm honest, because I'm not saying don't stick things down, it's not for me to say don't, but I do question why people want to stick things down. I said to somebody just last week, they said, is there any glue? And I said, yes, there is, because there was. I said, but would you like to kind of share with me why you might like to stick this particular aspect of your experience down? And they can't always answer that question, that kind of. And if you're dealing with teachers in particular, I work a lot with teachers and school leaders, they kind of want to be told what to do. I think that's another it's another angle of the conversation. They want to be told what to do. They want to know whether how long they've got to do it. That's another really interesting. How long have I got to do this? And is there any glue? That's kind of, I don't know what that says about teachers.
Your three questions.
Yeah, they're the three things. Yeah. Is there a right way to do it? And have you got any glue? And how long have I got?
I think that's really a really.
But it's interesting, isn't it?
Is this the right way to do it? Because one of the conversations that we always end up having in the classroom is there are no right and wrong answers. And you might put up a photo that doesn't fit into any of these themes or any of these boxes that we've been talking about, or I've looked at a photo and I've gone, I have no idea where that would fit. I'm going to need someone to explain that to me. Would the person that posted up be happy to do that? And invariably they are, and I'm like, okay, that makes more sense to me now. I can either put that in a box, or actually that still makes more sense, but I'm going to leave it sitting on its own. And they're like, oh, but it's not part of one of the themes. I'm like, yes, but this is about coding data. It doesn't need to necessarily fit. It can be one of the outliers. There are no right or wrong answers in qualitative research generally, let alone in something so creative.
Yeah, I think too, it's sometimes those outliers that become the most interesting kind of things, isn't it? And it's not about, I've got 3 of these and 3 in this box and whatever. Sometimes it's those singular examples, I think, that become the most interesting. Really interesting.
I've got a bit stuck in actually doing rather than what we're actually supposed to be talking about.
Just wondering, yeah, go on.
So, as we move beyond to the next stage of doing research and teaching these kinds of research methods, what are some of the key lessons that you will be taking forward into your practice?
From having done more online?
Yeah.
I think it's been a real beneficial experience, really. It's opened my mind up to a lot of things. I know we've talked about this a little bit before, but this whole idea of not having a box that I own, I loan out to somebody for a little while and then they give back. I think that's been a real eye-opener, this kind of being a little bit more flexible with the items that I can provide perhaps, but that others can bring to the process. I think that's been really useful. What I said earlier about this notion of having your own space to do the collage, I think that came up with one of our participants who said if they'd been in a big room with others, they don't think they would have felt as free to express themselves. And this kind of turning the camera off and having time and space to do it and not be observed, I think that's a really interesting aspect that I haven't thought about, but I think there's something in there. I'd quite like to think about that further. I think the ability to engage, if you're, I don't know, in an island in Scotland or on the Isle of Wight or somewhere in between here in the UK, I think that's been amazing because it's allowed people to come together to connect and to share in the creative process. You know, the people who wouldn't have met otherwise, they've engaged in a research kind of activity, but for them it's also been a learning activity, which I think has been really interesting. So they wouldn't have met otherwise. And actually it's allowed me to see that you can do these things that I think I just assumed had to be in person. And we've had the opportunity now to do it with small groups, we've done it with larger groups. There were about 25 people in one of our final workshops. And so it's just about being open to the fact that you don't have to pick it up and do it exactly like it was in person and then do it online. There are differences that you have to accommodate, like you can't see the full process. And I used to really quite like watching the full process, but there are ways around that. So some participants chose to photograph their collage in different stages. So after a few minutes they'd photograph it and then photograph it, and and then you can notice whether things have kind of either moved position or things have been added or taken away. So there are ways around it, but I think the mistake you make is to think you would do exactly what you do in person. It's a bit like teaching, isn't it, and teaching online generally, and lift it up and then just do it on Zoom or whatever. Yeah. I mean, I liked the whole screen sharing and all that kind of thing. I think that worked really efficiently, and on a very practical level with, with a research kind of hat on. Recording in Zoom is a dream because, the transcript's not perfect, but, it's a lot better than sitting there and typing stuff up. So you've got a ready-made transcript. You've got various different formats of recording, so you can have speaker view and gallery view and all those kind of things. So I think, there's a lot that we can learn from having done stuff online.
Absolutely.
So what about you? What are your thoughts on it?
I think for me it's definitely around that flexibility. I had students this year who were remoting from India, and obviously that comes with its own challenges, as you will know, but being able to teach online has been a really, really good experience for me. I've quite enjoyed it, and I hope that my students have quite enjoyed it. And I think when it comes to visual methods, I think one of the key things for me in terms of teaching these kinds of research methods, and to be fair, most research methods that I've embedded a really practical element, is one, there has to be a practical element. It's online teaching, it's going to be challenging, it needs to be interactive and enjoyable, and in a lot of ways playful. More so than if I was teaching in person, I think.
That's interesting, isn't it?
That's been really important to keep students engaged and interested and feel like they're doing something that's not a 9-to-5 job as well, because they are learning, and I want them to feel like they're learning and not just doing work. And the other thing I really found was checking in a little bit more regularly online. So when we've set these kind of activities about going off and doing these things, not only demonstrating them, so I would put pictures on the Padlet to make sure that students could see that I was also interacting, and these are the ways that you do it, but also every few minutes just saying, so how's everybody getting on? I'm just going to have a little bit of play with some of these images. I'm going to move them around a little bit, because otherwise in the sea of the online people can get a bit lost. Whereas when we're in the classroom, I might not necessarily stop the whole class and go, okay, I'm just going to do X. I might go up and have individual conversations with people, but I want, the students to feel like I am engaging in that process that they're going through. So checking in a little bit more regularly, but obviously not interrupting the flow, and it's quite a difficult balance.
I found that I actually I've got like a meditation bell, like a nice sounding bell, and I'd kind of ring that as a kind of look, I don't mean to interrupt, but can we, how we're doing, and because otherwise it can feel a bit sudden, can't it? Because if people have got their cameras off, it can be completely silent, can't it? And whereas in a room you would hear a rustling noise, or just shuffling around noises. And I think that silence sometimes, I didn't think I struggled with silence, but on occasions it can seem like a long period of time. So we used to give about 20 minutes for people to do their collages online. And, and if people have turned their cameras off or whatever, you're sitting there, you're thinking, okay, that felt a very long time sometimes. There is a tendency to want to kind of check in with people or whatever, but, 20 minutes. And then you'd come back, I'd kind of ring this bell and say, or I'd say, you can use the chat function as well, can't you, for that kind of thing, and just say, are we okay with just a couple of minutes to go, and that kind of thing, rather than kind of breaking in with noise. But I think time has a different dimension online. I think that's what I'm saying, is that those 20 minutes seem to go quite quickly when it's in person, but perhaps because there's more stimuli in a room, you can kind of notice things, whereas there's no real engagement. If people have chosen, and it's their choice, and that's fine, to turn their cameras off to do that, you're kind of sitting there thinking, well, I don't actually know what I need to be doing. But allowing them that space and that time to engage is what's needed. And so, it's interesting, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that until now, but that time did feel quite long. As
you say, time moves really differently. And I think, obviously teaching is very different than if you're actually doing the method. But that opportunity to check in, because particularly if you say you have 20 minutes in a space, in a physical space, you would watch someone, or you, not in a weird way, but you would be watching someone, you could see if they were struggling.
Exactly.
You could see if they were kind of stuck, and you can't do that necessarily online if they've got the camera off. So that almost sort of regular check-in, how's it going? Has anyone got any questions? Is it going okay? Needs to be at least I found a little bit more formalised online. But I like
more overt. Perhaps,
I like that idea what you're doing, interrupting with that really sort of gentle sound.
Yeah, well, that was part of us trying to, as I quoted, I think Sutherland earlier on, this aesthetic environment, and we did think about that. And I mean, we didn't just use collage; we used another method, which maybe won't go into too much detail now. But that was an embodied method, and so it just felt right to have this kind of gentle, rather than this really harsh sound. It's interesting actually. That kind of we use gesture. So I'll talk about it just quickly. We use gesture as a method to express how you lead change, and that was a lot more uncomfortable for people generally than collage. So it's interesting, isn't it? So we're talking about people being sceptical about collage. Well, they really were very sceptical about gesture. But interestingly again, the online nature of the workshops meant that we could say to people, I would model a gesture and they would see it. And then I say, if you fancy doing a gesture in response to this question, you can. You can either be seen or you can just do it behind, you can turn your camera off. And it meant, as a researcher, I didn't have that data. I didn't see their gesture. But it was an opportunity for them to engage in something that felt perhaps a little bit uncomfortable, but they did. And then they talked about it. And for some people, the opportunity to do that was really powerful. For some, they just sat there and said, I didn't get that at all. Well, that's okay. you can not get something, or you can not enjoy it. But I think the virtual nature of the workshops allowed that kind of activity perhaps to be experienced very differently than in a room where you can be seen doing these kind of gestures. So I mean, I haven't really thought about that until now, and we're only just writing up the report now. But I might have to think about that a little bit more, about how something, when you're in a bit more of a discomfort zone, where they're actually being, in your own little Zoom bubble, is actually affords a different kind of privacy than in person.
The opportunity for a safe space that you wouldn't necessarily have had.
Yeah, and I think that goes for all of the methods that we're talking about today, really.